Fortify. If those words look familiar, it's because you wrote them this morning. Those are the words we used this morning, is the words we're going to use tonight. And the reason being is because this is really the emphasis of what Peter is talking about, is that our faith is to be supplemented. Remember, we said that adding to our faith does not mean that we're using like building blocks and one placed upon another, and once we have that structure built, then everything is completed. That's not the idea. Add here is that idea of providing or supplementing. It's about having allies and reinforcements. It's about having counselors. It's about having advice. It's about having different things added to our faith that can rely upon one another. I appreciate Josh's prayer tonight in that he gave a really good review of what we talked about this morning when we talked about what does it mean then to add to our faith. Peter said in the first few verses, grace and peace be multiplied to you. And as was mentioned in the prayer, is that we are expected to add to our faith, but God is the one who actually multiplies the blessings that come from that. One of the blessings that comes from that is in that latter reading that we had for tonight, is that an entrance is supplied to us abundantly into the Lord's everlasting kingdom. And so we can know that we can be fruitful, that we can be productive, and that we can accomplish all that God would have us to accomplish because He has provided for us all the means necessary to accomplish those tasks. And so when we think about being called, as we said this morning, when we think about being called, it's not about being called by the greatest that man can achieve or man's glory or man's virtue. It's not so that we might receive some type of glory or virtue. It's because of God's glory and virtue we've been called. What we're going to see tonight that separates it sort of from this morning is some of the motivation. What's going to drive us to have real courage? What's going to help us to want and desire more knowledge and understanding? What is it that's going to help me whenever I do have to go about crucifying the flesh with its passions and desires, to exercise true self-control? What is it that's going to help me get through those things? And so at the latter end of this, he does tell us that if you forget who you were, you're very short-sighted. So again, one thing to emphasize and remember is this. By adding to your faith, you create time and distance between you and the person you used to be. And that time and distance between you and the person you used to be is vital for your spiritual survival. We have to crucify the old man, and he's been buried, and that grave needs to be walked away from. We need that time and distance between us and that old man. If not, we'll forget and we'll go right back into doing those things that we used to do. And so this morning, these are the things we talked about. Faith indeed being that foundation upon which everything is built. Virtue is that moral courage. But we said moral courage is not enough because morality as defined by men changes and is vacillating between one thing and another. And just because we do something that is perceived as being moral, even in our own opinion, and very, very courageous, does not mean that it's necessarily right. We saw that with the Apostle Paul. Therefore, we add to our virtue knowledge and understanding of how God views things, how God defines things, what God wants us to be courageous about, what God wants us to pursue. And then when we have that knowledge, we have to have the willingness to actually do something about it. And that's where self-control comes in. When it comes to having fears or frustrations, when it comes to putting aside passions or desires, we have to be willing to take up our cross daily and follow the Lord. And if need be, we have to put ourselves upon that cross and stay there, as we'll see in just a moment. Stay there until that moment of temptation and trial has passed. Whenever we sin, this list so far that we have, whenever we sin, that's where the failure occurs. It's a matter of we didn't have the courage, the moral excellence, we didn't have the understanding or knowledge, simple understanding and knowledge, or we lack self-control. That's where that occurs. These next several that we're going to talk about are some of the things that Satan will attack and try to use to get us back to where these things will fail once again. Because if we're trying to make it through on nothing more than just sheer willpower, we're not going to make it. So Peter's next thing in his list is perseverance. It is the ability to persevere. Going back to the analogy of the athlete goes through his training. He wants to excel. He wants to win the medal. He goes to a coach, and the coach tells him, these are the things you need to do in order to win that gold medal. These are the things you have to do in order to accomplish that task and win in this competition that you're endeavoring upon. And that athlete goes about that training regimen, but at some point his muscles begin to scream out and cry that I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to get up out of the bed that early in the morning. I don't want to say no to that certain food that I'm supposed to stay away from. I don't want to do this anymore. And so he has to sit down with his coach once again, and his coach has to tell him, you have to endure. You have to persevere. And that's what Peter is saying. We have to not, as we said, be nailed upon that cross. We have to stay there. And we have to stay there till it's done, till it's accomplished. We're told in passages, or first the definition of this term, hupomone, is a compound word meaning literally to live underneath, capacity to hold out or bear in the face of difficulty. It literally means that you make your home underneath something. It doesn't mean that there's a weight that's put upon you and you're able to carry it for a certain amount of time. This means to live underneath that burden, to live under that stress, to always be there and not give up. That's what persevere is. It's like the pillars of a house or great building, that those are the things that are living underneath the load. These load-bearing walls that you've heard about that are in your home that are so vital. You don't tear those down because the whole thing comes crumbling down. That's what we're talking about. We have to have that ability. We're told in Proverbs 24 and verse 10 that if in the day of adversity you fail, your strength is small. If the time of testing comes and you fall short, your strength is small. That strength that's being talked about, that lack of ability to persevere, are those first three things: virtue, knowledge, self-control. Those things have given out, and you're no longer able to persevere. You've quit. And the writer of Proverbs does not put that forth as being a good and honorable thing. We know in other passages, like in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, that Peter reminded the brethren in his first epistle that in this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you've been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen you love, though now you do not see him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of joy. What Jesus promised each and every one of us is that we're going to be hated. There's going to be people who despise us, that we're going to be facing the devil every day. And he's like a roaring lion, always around us, seeking whom he may devour. His desire is for each and every one of us, but we're expected, as it was with Cain, to rule over him and not to give up. In the midst of those things, we are bearing underneath the strain and pressure of living in a world that does not appreciate who we are or what we're trying to accomplish. Our prayers are simply, don't hinder us in being able to serve our God and do what he would have us to do. And it's a simple prayer. And we're expecting that no matter what economy or what society or what circumstances, to always be able to bear up underneath that load and not to quit. And Peter says that even in that, we're supposed to greatly rejoice. And we know how strange that sounds to us. Rejoice in the fact that we've been put through all these different things. The reason that we're able to do that, though, is because we're not looking toward things that are carnal in nature. We're not looking toward the flesh, as we referred to earlier in this list. These are things which are according to the divine nature. My spiritual man is being renewed day by day, even as the flesh is being destroyed. Then I'm being made stronger and wiser and more closely aligned with who my Savior is through the result of these things. I can make it through even this. God doesn't allow me to be tempted beyond what is my ability to withstand. Everything that we encounter in this life, he has provided for me a way of escape. I can make it through this. I can make it through it today, and I can make it through tomorrow. Brother, whatever it is that you're struggling with, whatever it is that is hurting you, whatever it is that's putting pressure on your life, whatever it is that feels like it's a crushing weight, you are stronger than that. You are able to stand underneath that load. You are able to bear it. And as you're going through it, this can work for you something that is much greater. It is not fun. It does not feel good. It is a heavy burden, and it cannot be denied that it is something that you do not want to be carrying. And it may not even be something that could be fair that you're carrying it, but you're carrying it. And it is what you are bearing under the load of. Remember, self-control was about self-denial. It's about putting yourself upon the cross. perseverance. This one is about the load. This one is about the burden. And it means that you carry it and you do it for as long as you need to. And praise be to God who it is who gives us the strength to do such things as that. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 32 through 38, the Hebrew writer, as you know, is dealing with brethren who are wanting to turn back to the world and possibly even to Judaism from the ways of God and Christ. And he tells them in verse 32 to recall the former days. And he tells them that in these former days you were illuminated. And in these former days, he says, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations. That's the idea of being thrown into an arena, really, like the stadiums to be killed in. Partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me and my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Therefore, don't cast away your reward. They had the virtue, they had the knowledge, they had the self-control in times past, that even when people were coming in and taking their property, taking their lives, and making them a public spectacle before all men, they endured those things for a while. And so he says, don't cast off your confidence. It is not enough for us to be confident and have those early yearnings of what it was like when we first obeyed the gospel. And it's good that we have those moments so that we can reflect and look back and say, you know, when I first became a Christian, I was planning on converting the entire world. And I was going to go out here and do all these things, and I was going to stand opposed to Satan at every opportunity, and I was going to do all these great and wonderful things. It's good that we're able to look back and see those things and remember those moments. But that was when you were young and immature. And that young and immature Christian is not strong enough to get you through what you're facing today. You've grown since then. You're facing new trials since then. And we can't be short-sighted. We have to remember what it's like to see Jesus and what he endured and what he went through. And so the Hebrew writer says, don't cast off your confidence. It does have great reward, for you have, in verse 36, need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. Having those initial threats, having those initial moments where you were tried and tested and you stood for a time in the midst of that, you haven't accomplished the will yet. The will of God is that you persevere through the next one and the next one and the next one, that you bear underneath the load, that you live underneath the load. It speaks to us about how much we need to recognize that we do actually go through, and the actual pressure that's put upon us, not so that we may pity ourselves, but that we might be realistic about the weight that we have upon us and know that we can carry it, that our God is sufficient. If I add to my faith, God is the one who multiplies in all things. So in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, the Hebrew writer continues by saying, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God. Consider him, he says in verse 3, who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. This is the point, is that virtue and knowledge and self-control can only get us so far. We have to be able to also persevere. And so in those moments where we start to feel weak, where I don't think I can make it, stop looking at yourself. Stop concentrating upon how hard and difficult this is for you, and draw strength from the same thing that Jesus did. Jesus, for the joy set before him, Jesus looked to the reward. Jesus looked to what was coming. Jesus did not give up hope. Jesus did not stop. Jesus stayed upon the cross. Jesus did not step down. Jesus endured everything because Jesus was looking for the joy of knowing that, brethren, we were going to be saved by what he did. And that was enough for him. That's what we do. If the Son of God himself needed a source of strength and endurance, then, brethren, we do as well. And so we need to be able to persevere. But perseverance, even that in and of itself can be difficult and can cause problems. Because as we're trying to persevere, we may do it for a lot of different reasons. There are some people who don't give up and give in, but they do it because they're stubborn and hard-headed. I don't know any of those people. However, that's how most of us are. The only reason we don't give up is because we're hard-headed. But what Peter next point to, I believe, is the real reason why we don't quit and we don't give up. Add to your perseverance, he says, godliness. That word godliness is something that this past week in my studies was very meaningful to me. It literally means worship rightly directed, devotion or complete commitment to God, a truly religious life. What's unique about this word is it's not the word God-likeness. Godliness is an intense need for God's favor and approval. It is wanting something that's actually worthy and deserving of worship. It is coming to an understanding that I can't do it on my own. I can't make it by myself. I'm the one who has to make the decision, but I need some kind of source of strength, some reason behind it. That's where godliness comes in. As I said, it's not God-likeness. That's a different word and a different understanding. In this here, we're not talking about becoming God-like. It's about desiring God more than absolutely anything. It is about needing God more than absolutely anything, more than breath itself, more than light, more than food, more than water, more than anything else, just desiring to see the face of God. That's what godliness, piety, is about. It's about proving that it's not just about going to a worship assembly, but it's about truly worshiping. It's about living each day in accordance with the things that we say we actually believe and showing it by the life that I lead. That God, I'm doing this not so that I can say I made it through, not so I can say I was strong enough, and not to say that even my brethren were there for me and helped me make it through this, but that God, you are the reason I made it through. God, you are the reason I'm not going to be cowardly. God, you are the reason that I want to know. And everything that I see, the sun coming up, the wind rustling through the grass, all of it speaks to me of the fact that there is a God in heaven and that He cares. It is about serving Him with true devotion and wanting more than anything else to thank Him for being our God and being our Father. Naturally, being like Him is going to follow that. But godliness, true piety, means that our life is focused around worship and desire for Him. It goes beyond being a good moral person. I can remember for a lot of years, this is the way that I thought that life was supposed to be lived. Just so long as they could write on my headstone, he was a good moral person, then that would be enough. Or as we say in the South, he was a good old boy. And it's not enough. And what a sad reality it is for many that rising to the highest standard of morals within the current society is all that God is asking for us to do. Is God's bar that low, really? You go through, and as we've been studying in Exodus, and we refer to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and how they're so very closely related together, is God's highest moral standard for us to just not kill somebody? To not commit adultery? To not bear false witness? To not covet something that belongs to my neighbor? Is that God's highest moral standard for us? And if I don't do those things, does it prove that God is the one I'm devoted to? Or might it be that I'm just trying to avoid consequences? It's not about being the higher form of ourselves. It's about being more like our Father and having His true nature and character and not just His actions. There's a few of the Psalms that I want us to look at. And these are Psalms that we've read before. We even have songs that reflect some of the words we're going to read. But in Psalm 42, one of the beautiful songs that we have is that song that talks about the deer panting for the water. And here in Psalm 42 that it's based upon, it says that as the deer pants for the water brooks, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? That is what godliness is. That type of godliness will naturally lead to godlikeness. It will naturally lead to higher moral standards than the world around us lives. But godliness is panting for God, thirsting for God. When shall I come and appear before my God? Psalm 63, in verses 1 through 4. Psalm 63, the first 4 verses. Here the psalmist says, God, you are my God. Some of your versions say, earnestly will I seek you. The New King James I like because it says, early will I seek you. When you're earnest about something, when you're honest about something, you're going to get up early to try to get it accomplished. Oh God, you are my God. Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land. And I have to say amen to that, about how dry and thirsty this world is that we are living in, where there is no water. So I have looked for you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory, because your loving kindness is better than life. My lips shall praise you. Thus I will bless you while I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. And over again, the Psalms have this loving devotion to God and to His Word, and this devotion to wanting to see the face of God and to be near Him. That's what godliness is. Unfortunately, I think sometimes we get into this trap where we feel like, well, if I'm just doing certain things, and that makes me godlike because I showed up for services, and I didn't commit this sin or that sin, and all those in and of themselves, that's great. But godliness is much more than that. And your faith needs much more than that. Your faith needs you to not only be with the brethren, to assemble and worship, but what your faith really needs is to worship, to where you can live that faith out in the world. What it needs is when you come into the sanctuary, as it were for us, when you come into that environment, it's to see more clearly the face of God each and every time. Remember, it's that we might be partakers of the divine nature. We've escaped the carnal, and there is so much more that we're looking forward to. And that's what God gives us whenever we add to our faith these things. To godliness, something that is also needed is brotherly kindness. When I become more aligned with the very nature, mindset, and disposition of God, it causes me to look at other people differently. And notice how far down in the list brotherly kindness is. Because sometimes it takes a lot for us to be kind to others, even brothers. But if we add to our faith these other things, it's going to take a whole lot more than your parents saying, be nice to your sister, before you're going to be nice to your sister. It takes understanding of who they are and the relationship you have with them. And so brotherly kindness, I skipped a verse. Paul talks about at the end of his letter to Timothy, he uses the word, and all I really wanted to bring out from that is Paul uses the word finally. That finally there's laid up for me a crown of life. That Paul was ready to be done with it all, to go on to be with the Father. And so brotherly kindness, as I said, the word itself comes from the word Philadelphia that we know so well, the city of brotherly love. That word just means fondness of one's brethren. What's interesting about it, though, is that sometimes I think we look at this word as being a lesser form of love, that it's not as meaningful in the Scriptures when you come upon this word. And I think we may be slightly mistaken about that in some ways. This is about the fondness or the attachment that we have to our brothers. But this is the word that was used most commonly when you think about Greek cultures. This was their highest form of love, if you will. And so in the Bible, we have the word agape, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But there's this relationship between agape and phileo that Philadelphia is based upon that really we shouldn't try to distinguish a whole lot between those. Let's notice a couple of examples. In 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 9, There are definite differences, but we also need to see, and I want us to stress and emphasize some of the similarities. 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 9, both of these words are used. But concerning brotherly love, obviously Philadelphia, but concerning brotherly love, you have no need that I should write to you, for you yourselves are taught by God to agape one another. And so when he talks about brotherly love, brotherly affection, phileo type of love, he says you've been taught by God to agape one another. And so Paul actually uses both of those words in that verse interchangeably to talk about their closeness of connection. And to his audience, that would have been that way. But there's other places in the scriptures as well to emphasize this is not a weak form of love. In places like John 5 and verse 20, I want us to go to John's gospel and notice some of the ways that it's used and the circumstances around it. John 5 and verse 20. Here Jesus is speaking for the Father, phileo, the Son. I dare say that none of us would think that that is a weak form of love. That God had a brotherly love, a fondness, an affection for his Son. It's not wrong to say, and it's not something that makes it weak, because we have a fondness, an affection for one another. We're family. We're family. We're those who have exercised courage, that are always trying to learn a little bit more about what God would have us to do and to be. We're doing our best to control ourselves and exercise that self-control, though it's put to the test. We're the kind of people that we have a huge burden upon us, a load that we're having to carry. And we've been there to help one another with that. And that perseverance is one of those things that helps us to understand how God truly views things. We value worship, and we value worshiping together because we stir one another up to love and good works. And that's one of the things that causes us to be fond of one another and have affection for one another. God doesn't want us to just put up with each other. He wants us to have a fondness and affection. He wants us to see ourselves as a family, brothers and sisters. Jesus even said, "Who are my mother? Who are my brothers and my sisters?" You know, many of us are very independent, in our nation. We're independent people, and I grew up being very, very independent. And one of the things I used to think about need of brethren was this, is that as I would get older and more mature, my need to lean on brethren would naturally decrease, because I would be able to stand more and more on my own. To be like Daniel in the lion's den by himself. To be like the 3 Hebrews who would not bow down to the idol. To be, even if all the world forsake God, I'm not going to turn my back on him. And so I had this false idea that the more I mature, the more I grow, the less I would need brotherly kindness and affection. And that is absolutely wrong. One of the things that I have seen is that the older and more mature I get, the more I actually need brethren. Not just want and desire, need. God made it that way, that we are supposed to need one another. Jesus had relationships in his own life. When you turn over to John chapter 11, verse 3, you know the scene that's there in John 11 of Lazarus who has died. Therefore the sisters sent to Jesus, saying, "Lord, behold, he whom you phileo is sick." Did Jesus have agape love for him? Absolutely. But did Jesus have a fondness, an affection for Lazarus and his family? Absolutely. At the end of John 11 and verse 36, as he is wept at the graveside, the Jews said, "See how he phileoed him," that he had affection and fondness. John 20, it speaks about the disciple whom Jesus loved. We understand that, and I believe it's probably the case that it's John, the writer himself, who was a relative of Jesus, and yet Jesus did have an affection for him. When we think about God looking at us, I don't want God to just put up with me. I would want God to have a true affection for me. Yes, I want him to agape me. I want him to love me regardless, and he does. But it's also meaningful to me to know that God does have a kind affection for us. Brethren, we need brotherly love. We should strive for brotherly love. And in the Scriptures, brotherly love is at the heart of so many different passages that talk about the importance. There's a day approaching, and we know that there's a danger of people drifting back into the world, even among our brethren. So we are not to be negligent about encouraging one another and admonishing one another and not neglecting one another, as it says in Hebrews 3:12 and 13. That we are to consider one another, not ourselves. Not do I want to go to worship today. Not do I feel like worshiping today. Not do I want to. What does my brother need? Because that's what godliness is about. What does my brother need? And I consider that when I come into the assembly. What do I need to do to stir you up to love and good works? That's what it's about. Chapter 12 and 13, as the Hebrew writer is bringing his letter to a conclusion, and he reminds the brethren that this brotherly love is something that's supposed to continue amongst us and be an ongoing thing. He says in Hebrews 12, verses 12 and 13, "Therefore strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather be healed." God wants us to be able to stand. And often what my brother needs to stand is for me to be by their side. And that's what brotherly love is all about. And then, even though with brotherly love, sometimes you don't particularly feel fond of one another. Sometimes we don't feel particularly affectionate toward one another. So what do we add to our brotherly love? That's where we come to that last of the list, where he says, add to brotherly love or affection, kindness, love. And this is agape. That's affection or goodwill or love or benevolence. And I want you to notice too that there is nothing that's added to love. All these others have some way in which they may fail. There is no way in which love fails. Love is the ultimate. There's no law against love. Where everything else falls short, love doesn't. Love meets the test and meets the calling. It rises to whatever the occasion is. Romans 5 tells us that, for a righteous person, someone may dare to die. But for an ungodly person, but God demonstrated his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It rose to the occasion. It rises to the occasion when we are like our God and we have the same mindset of our God, that we view even our enemies as an opportunity for God to be glorified by us being kind, generous, lending, forgiving, and merciful to them. Even our enemy. It rises to the occasion. It doesn't demand anything in repayment from someone else. It acts because it's the goodwill that should be extended to someone. You're also made in the image of God, and I want you to go to heaven. What can I do to help you accomplish that? And you may hate me, you may be my enemy, but I'm going to do whatever I can to help you get there. That rises to the occasion, and there's no limitations placed upon it. It's something that can't be faked. In 1 Corinthians 13, Paul said, I can give all of my goods to the poor. I can give my body to be burned. I can be sacrificed on the altar for all these different things. But if I don't have love, all I'm doing is just clanging cymbals. I'm just making a lot of noise. It means nothing. And so love is patient. Love is kind. Love is merciful. Love does not parade itself. Love believes all things, hopes all things, trusts all things. We go through that list of love at weddings, and then we forget it when we move into our homes together. We counsel young people, remember, this is what love is to look like. And if you're dating someone, if they don't meet this, if you can't put their name in the place of love in that list, that's probably not a person who loves you or that you love them. And then we come into the worship assembly with people that we never show love toward. Love rises to the occasion. That's what it's about. Spiritual gifts, chapters 12 and 14 of 1 Corinthians, they're not going to get it done. They're great, they're wonderful, there's something that people brag about, it's not going to get it done. What's going to help you? Love. What's the answer? What's the solution? Love. You have faith, that's great. You hope? Awesome. Love is greater than that. There's no limitation. on it. There's no barrier placed upon it. There's nothing more to add when it comes to love. But notice that love is also at the end of that list, which means we're going to have to go through a huge process to really have that agape type of love that we've been talking about. And so this is what it is that truly proves whose disciple we are. John chapter 13, 34 and 35, Jesus says he gives a new commandment. It's new because we had never seen love before, not real love. Remember, before Jesus Christ came and gave himself on the cross, we had never seen a true, verifiable act of love for all of mankind that really made a difference. Never. In the history of mankind, never. But because of Jesus Christ, and because of us loving one another as Christ loved us, that's what shows the world. That's what makes a difference. That we can show people what true love really looks like. And so 1 John 4, verses 8 and 16 tells us that God is love. And if you say that you love God but you can't love one another, that you're not speaking the truth and it's not in you. But a person who truly has God's love living in him, this is a person who finds it easy to love others and is not going to hold back. It rises to the occasion, whatever it may be. And so the thing I'm going to ask you tonight as we close is your faith being fortified? Are there things that you've added to your faith so that God can multiply the blessings that he has in store? Everything that you need for heaven to be your home, God has made it available for you. But it's your responsibility. It's your choice. And it is a difficult decision. It's a difficult choice to make. It takes a lot of energy. However, it is one that is never regretted. No matter how much diligence you put into it, you have never wasted your time and you haven't wasted your energy. Heaven is worth it. So Peter says in his last letter that we have recorded, so long as I am in this tent, I'm going to remind you of these things. Though you already know them, though your minds are pure, I want to stir up your pure minds by way of reminder to remember these things. And so if we can help you in any way, if there's something that you need in order to make it to heaven, please let us know. As together we stand and sing this song, won't you please come?